At the close of the 19th century, the United States entered a period of unprecedented material acceleration. Industrial production expanded at a scale never before experienced in the Republic. Railroads stitched together distant regions, capital moved faster than law could restrain it, and private fortunes accumulated with a velocity that unsettled even their beneficiaries. In this environment, architecture became more than shelter or ornament. It became a public argument about legitimacy. The great mansions of the Gilded Age were not simply residences, they were spatial declarations, built to convert newly acquired wealth into the appearance of permanence, continuity, and inherited authority. Stone, scale, and symmetry were pressed into service as moral language, intended to reassure a society uneasy with the speed at which its elites had risen. These houses emerged at a moment when American wealth lacked ancestry. Unlike European aristocracies whose estates had grown slowly through land tenure and dynastic marriage, the new American elite derived its power from finance, extraction, and industrial consolidation. This created a problem of perception. Wealth could be counted, but authority required something else. The mansions supplied that missing dimension. Through architectural reference, Renaissance palazzi, French chateaux, English country houses, American industrialists borrowed the visual grammar of older hierarchies. Limestone facades, axial approaches, and ceremonial staircases performed a symbolic function, suggesting order where economic life had become volatile and disorienting. The sighting of these mansions reinforced their claims. In cities like New York, Newport, and later on Long Island's North Shore, elite residences were positioned to command views, exclude intrusion, and separate their inhabitants from the industrial realities that produced their fortunes. Spatial distance was moral distance. The mansion stood apart from the tenement and the factory, elevated both literally and figuratively. This separation was not accidental. It reflected a worldview in which power was understood as something that should be insulated, stabilized, and rendered invisible through refinement. Inside, the organization of space followed strict hierarchies. Public rooms were arranged to choreograph movement, directing guests through sequences of impression and restraint. Reception halls announced scale without intimacy. Dining rooms emphasized formality over comfort. Libraries and galleries communicated cultivation rather than use. Servant corridors, staircases, and quarters were concealed within walls and below floors, ensuring that labor remained present but unseen. Architecture thus naturalized inequality by embedding it into everyday movement. One did not need to be told who belonged where. The building itself instructed. This architectural language also responded to anxiety. The Gilded Age was marked by labor unrest, financial panics, and growing public criticism of concentrated wealth. Strikes shut down railroads. Newspapers exposed monopolistic practices. Reform movements questioned the moral legitimacy of vast private fortunes in a democratic society. The mansion answered these pressures not with argument, but with endurance. Stone walls implied stability. Imported materials suggested global reach. Classical proportions evoked timeless order. In this way, architecture attempted to quiet social tension by aesthetic means. Yet the permanence suggested by these structures masked a fundamental instability. The wealth that financed them was often tied to speculative markets, political favor, and legal frameworks still in flux. Antitrust legislation, inheritance taxation, and regulatory oversight were emerging precisely as these houses reached completion. The mansion thus stood at a historical threshold. It was both the culmination of unchecked accumulation and the prelude to its constraint. What appeared solid was, in structural terms, exposed. The labor required to construct and maintain these estates further complicates their symbolism. Thousands of craftsmen, builders, and domestic workers sustained environments designed to erase their presence. Marble was quarried and transported across oceans. Wood was carved by hand. Landscapes were reshaped to produce the illusion of effortless nature. Maintenance never ceased. The mansion's authority depended on constant human input, even as its aesthetic suggested self-sufficiency. This contradiction lay at the heart of elite domestic architecture. Power was displayed as effortless while being relentlessly produced. Over time, the meaning of these buildings began to shift. As the first generation of owners aged and died, their heirs encountered a different America. Progressive reform altered tax structures. Social norms changed. The scale that once communicated authority now implied excess. Maintenance costs became burdens rather than proofs of success. Properties built to endure centuries confronted a society increasingly indifferent to their claims. Architecture, once an ally of power, became a liability. In this sense, the Gilded Age mansion can be read as both monument and warning. It reveals how elites attempt to translate economic dominance into cultural legitimacy and how fragile that translation can be. Stone does not guarantee continuity. Grandeur does not resolve contradiction. The houses remain, but their original purpose has faded. What survives is the structure, stripped of the authority it once sought to project, waiting to be reinterpreted by a society no longer willing to accept its assumptions. The men who commissioned America's great Gilded Age mansions often understood, with a clarity born of insecurity, that money alone did not guarantee authority. Their fortunes had been amassed within a single lifetime, sometimes within a single decade, through railroads, steel, oil, finance, and speculation. This velocity distinguished them from the landed elites of Europe, whose power rested on centuries of accumulation and gradual consolidation. In the United States, wealth arrived too quickly to be trusted. It demanded justification. Architecture became the most immediate and persuasive means by which that justification could be staged. Families such as the Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, and Carnegies were acutely aware of their historical thinness. Many had risen from modest or commercial origins that offered little cultural prestige. Cornelius Vanderbilt's wealth, for example, emerged from shipping and railroads, industries associated with disruption rather than refinement. John D. Rockefeller's fortune grew from oil consolidation that provoked widespread resentment. Andrew Carnegie's steel empire relied on labor systems that generated both productivity and profound social conflict. These men were celebrated for their success and criticized for the methods that produced it. The mansion was designed to resolve that contradiction by reframing economic dominance as cultural stewardship. European architectural models offered a solution precisely because they carried the weight of inherited legitimacy. When American elites commissioned Beaux-Arts architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, or demanded replicas of Italian Renaissance palazzi and French chateaux, they were not expressing aesthetic preference alone. They were borrowing historical authority. These buildings implied lineage where none existed. They suggested continuity where rupture defined reality. In stone and ornament, new money attempted to speak the language of old power, yet the absence of true inheritance could not be entirely concealed. Unlike European estates, which were often embedded within systems of land tenure, legal privilege, and political authority, American mansions stood isolated from structural power. Their owners wielded enormous influence, but it was contingent. It depended on market conditions, political tolerance, and public perception. The buildings projected sovereignty, but they rested on foundations that were economic rather than institutional. This distinction would prove decisive. Inheritance itself became a point of tension. Many Gilded Age fortunes were divided among heirs unprepared or unwilling to sustain them at their original scale. The costs of maintaining vast estates, staff salaries, repairs, taxes, and social obligations grew heavier as revenues fluctuated. Unlike European aristocracies, American elites lacked entrenched legal mechanisms to protect estates from fragmentation. Primogeniture had never taken hold. Wealth dispersed as families expanded. Mansions built for dynastic permanence confronted demographic and legal realities that undermined their purpose. The cultural environment also shifted. By the early 20th century, public attitudes toward concentrated wealth hardened. Progressive reformers challenged the legitimacy of vast private fortunes. Journalists exposed corporate abuses. Antitrust legislation curtailed monopolistic practices. The introduction of income and inheritance taxes altered the calculus of accumulation. In this new climate, the mansion's symbolic value reversed. What had once signaled stability now suggested excess. Grandeur became a liability, inviting scrutiny rather than admiration. This transformation revealed a deeper truth about American elite power. It was never fully institutionalized. It lacked the slow sedimentation of authority that architecture sought to simulate. The mansion attempted to compress centuries of legitimacy into a single structure, but history resisted such compression. Buildings could imitate the forms of inherited power, but they could not reproduce its social foundations. When economic conditions shifted, the architectural shell remained, exposed as performance rather than guarantee. The owners themselves often sensed this fragility. Philanthropy expanded alongside mansion building, serving as a parallel strategy of legitimation. Libraries, universities, and museums were endowed to offset criticism and frame wealth as public service. Yet even these efforts acknowledged implicitly that private authority required constant reinforcement. The mansion alone was insufficient. It needed narrative support, moral framing, and social acceptance. Without these, stone could not speak convincingly. As generations passed, the gap between architectural ambition and social reality widened. Heirs sold properties, donated them to institutions, or abandoned them altogether. What remained was a landscape of excess structures detached from the power they once claimed to embody. The mansions did not fail because they were poorly built. They failed because the social order they attempted to summon never fully existed. They were monuments to aspiration rather than inheritance, and history eventually revealed the difference. Behind the facades of marble and limestone, the daily operation of America's Gilded Age mansions depended on systems of labor as intricate and disciplined as the industries that financed them. These houses functioned less as private homes than as controlled environments, requiring constant human presence to sustain the illusion of effortless refinement. Every polished surface, every regulated temperature, every carefully timed meal reflected an architecture that assumed perpetual service. The mansion's authority did not arise from solitude or self-sufficiency, but from an unbroken chain of human work designed to remain unseen. Domestic service was organized according to strict hierarchies that mirrored the social order outside the walls. Housekeepers, butlers, valets, maids, cooks, gardeners, and chauffeurs occupied clearly defined roles, governed by rigid schedules and spatial separation. Architectural plans made this hierarchy explicit. Service staircases were narrow and concealed. Corridors curved away from public rooms. Bells and speaking tubes allowed commands to travel without requiring presence. The house itself disciplined labor, ensuring that servants appeared only when summoned and vanished immediately afterward. In this way, architecture transformed inequality into routine. This invisibility was central to the mansion's symbolic function. To display power as natural and unforced, labor had to disappear from view. Guests encountered abundance without effort, order without instruction, comfort without visible cost. The absence of visible labor suggested that refinement was inherent rather than produced. Yet this concealment required extraordinary coordination. Servants rose before dawn, retired long after guests departed, and remained perpetually attentive. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of a house designed to deny their significance. The scale of these estates intensified this dynamic. Large mansions often employed dozens of full-time staff, sometimes more during social seasons. In Newport or Fifth Avenue, a single dinner could mobilize cooks, footmen, florists, musicians, and cleaners in precise sequence. Failure was unacceptable. Mistakes disrupted not only service but symbolism. A late course or visible servant threatened the illusion that wealth translated naturally into order. The pressure to perform was constant, and discipline was enforced through dismissal rather than dialogue. Labor was replaceable, the house was not. This system carried broader implications. While industrial labor increasingly became the subject of public debate through strikes, reform movements, and legislation, domestic labor remained largely private and unregulated. Servants occupied an ambiguous position, neither fully industrial workers nor members of the family. Their isolation within private estates shielded conditions from scrutiny. Long hours, limited privacy, and strict behavioral codes were normalized as part of service. Architecture enabled this normalization by structuring space to minimize contact and maximize control. The mansion thus embodied a contradiction. It presented itself as a refuge from industrial modernity, a realm of culture and repose, yet it relied on labor practices shaped by the same forces of efficiency, hierarchy, and disposability that characterized factories and railroads. The difference lay in visibility. Industrial labor was noisy, collective, and increasingly politicized. Domestic labor was silent, fragmented, and hidden. The mansion transformed modern exploitation into classical order. As the 20th century progressed, this arrangement became increasingly unsustainable. Changing labor markets reduced the availability of domestic servants willing to accept such conditions. Immigration patterns shifted. Alternative employment opportunities expanded. Social attitudes towards service evolved. What had once been a large and compliant workforce diminished, and wages rose accordingly. The cost of maintaining invisibility increased. Houses designed for constant staffing struggled to adapt to environments where labor could no longer be taken for granted. This shift exposed the mansion's dependence on a social order already fading. Rooms designed for display rather than use became liabilities. Kitchens scaled for large staffs proved inefficient. Servant wings stood empty or were repurposed awkwardly. The architecture revealed its assumptions rooted in a belief that hierarchy was stable and labor inexhaustible. When that belief collapsed, the house lost coherence. The decline of domestic service did more than alter household logistics. It stripped the mansion of its performative power. Without invisible labor, abundance became conspicuous effort. Grandeur required explanation. What had once appeared natural now seemed theatrical. The building could no longer conceal the work required to sustain it, and thus could no longer convincingly claim authority. In this way, the mansion's fate was tied not only to wealth and inheritance, but to the changing moral economy of labor itself. As the 20th century opened, the social meaning of America's great mansions began to change in ways their builders had neither anticipated nor controlled. What had once been read as evidence of national progress increasingly appeared as a provocation. Economic inequality, long present but unevenly acknowledged, entered public consciousness with new force. The same structures that had been designed to quiet unease now attracted attention as symbols of imbalance. Architecture, which had served as a shield, became a target. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It emerged through overlapping pressures that altered how wealth was understood and judged. Investigative journalism exposed corporate consolidation and political influence. Labor disputes revealed the human cost of industrial efficiency. Economic downturns made private opulence visible against widespread insecurity. In this climate, the mansion's scale no longer suggested stability. It suggested insulation. Its remoteness from ordinary life became a moral statement, whether intended or not. Public access to elite spaces remained limited, but their presence was unavoidable. Fifth Avenue's facades confronted urban passers-by daily. Newport summer cottages, increasingly recognized as palaces in all but name, dominated landscapes shaped by seasonal privilege. Newspapers and illustrated magazines reproduced images of ballrooms and staircases, turning private interiors into public spectacle. What had been constructed to control perception now circulated beyond the owner's authority. Architecture entered mass culture, and with it, judgment. This exposure intensified political response. Reformers framed excessive domestic architecture as evidence of unearned privilege. The progressive era's regulatory ambitions extended beyond markets into moral economy. Income taxes, inheritance taxes, and corporate oversight altered the conditions that had enabled unchecked accumulation. While these measures did not target mansions directly, they reshaped the environment in which such buildings could be justified. Maintaining vast private estates became more costly, not only financially but reputationally. Owners responded unevenly. Some attempted discretion, reducing public display and retreating into privacy. Others embraced philanthropy more visibly, donating collections, funding institutions, or opening properties for charitable events. These gestures acknowledged a shifting social contract. Wealth, once defended through architecture alone, now required public explanation. The mansion's role changed from assertion to liability management. The architecture itself proved inflexible. Built to project authority through separation and grandeur, it adapted poorly to a culture demanding accountability and access. Large ceremonial rooms lacked practical purpose outside formal entertaining. Landscapes designed for exclusivity resisted integration into public life. Efforts to repurpose these spaces often expose their original intent too clearly to disguise. The house revealed its history even as it attempted reinvention. World events accelerated this reckoning. The First World War disrupted transatlantic cultural reference points, weakening the prestige of European models American elites had long imitated. Economic instability following the war, culminating in the Great Depression, further eroded tolerance for conspicuous private luxury. In times of widespread hardship, permanence lost its appeal. Grandeur invited criticism rather than admiration. The mansion stood as a reminder of inequality that could no longer be aestheticized away. By the 1930s, many estates entered a period of uncertainty. Some were sold at fractions of their construction cost. Others were subdivided, abandoned, or demolished. A few survived through institutional transformation, becoming museums, schools, or government buildings. These outcomes varied, but they shared a common cause. The social environment that had given meaning to these structures had dissolved. Without acceptance, architecture could not sustain authority on its own. What remained was resentment embedded in stone. The mansion no longer spoke with confidence. It waited to be interpreted, recontextualized, and often judged. Its endurance did not confirm the triumph of elite ambition. Instead, it recorded the limits of architectural power in a society increasingly unwilling to confuse wealth with legitimacy. The house still stood, but the argument it once made had been lost. The Gilded Age mansion had been conceived as a solution to a specific problem: how to make sudden wealth appear settled, durable, and entitled to command respect across generations. Yet it was inheritance, not construction, that ultimately tested this ambition. When the original builders died, the houses they left behind confronted realities for which stone and ornament offered no defense. The transfer of wealth exposed the fragility of an elite power structure that had never fully resolved its relationship with time. American inheritance law differed fundamentally from the aristocratic systems these mansions imitated. Estates were rarely protected by primogeniture, entail, or long-established legal mechanisms designed to preserve land and titles intact. Wealth passed laterally rather than vertically, divided among children, spouses, and trusts. Large households fractured into smaller units, authority dispersed. The mansion, built to anchor a singular patriarchal presence, became an inconvenience to heirs whose lives no longer centered on its scale or symbolism. Financial pressure intensified this fragmentation. Property taxes, maintenance costs, staffing expenses, and increasingly aggressive inheritance taxation eroded the feasibility of private ownership. Houses designed to impress hundreds demanded resources that few heirs could justify sustaining. Even families that retained significant wealth faced competing priorities: urban residences, business interests, travel, philanthropy, and modern lifestyles incompatible with rigid domestic hierarchies. The mansion required not only money, but commitment to a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. Cultural distance compounded these pressures. The generation that inherited Gilded Age estates did not experience wealth as conquest. They encountered it as responsibility and often burden. Many had been educated abroad, exposed to changing social norms, and shaped by political movements that questioned inherited privilege. The symbolic function of the mansion, once a tool of self-assertion, held little relevance for individuals less concerned with proving legitimacy than with managing perception. In this context, permanence appeared less like stability and more like stagnation. Attempts to adapt these properties revealed the limits of architectural intention. Some heirs modernized interiors, reducing staff requirements and altering layouts. Others sold land, subdividing estates in ways that undermined their original coherence. In resort communities such as Newport, entire landscapes of elite exclusivity fragmented as properties were repurposed or dismantled. The mansion proved resistant to partial survival. It demanded total commitment or none at all. Philanthropic donation emerged as a common resolution, but one that altered meaning irrevocably. When estates were transferred to universities, museums, or the state, their authority shifted from private dominance to public memory. The house no longer asserted power, it explained it. Architecture that had once claimed legitimacy now required interpretation. Docents replaced servants, plaques replaced protocols. What endured was not control, but narrative. This transformation marked a decisive break. The mansion's failure was not architectural but social. It had been designed to outlast scrutiny, to stabilize wealth through form, and to anchor power across time. Instead, it revealed how quickly power could dissolve when its supporting structures, legal, cultural, and moral, proved insufficient. The building survived. The system it served did not. By mid-century, the Gilded Age mansion had become an artifact rather than an instrument. Its rooms bore traces of ambition but no longer shaped behavior. Its scale inspired curiosity rather than obedience. Inheritance, once imagined as the mechanism of permanence, exposed the truth that authority cannot be built faster than society is willing to absorb it. The houses remained, but they no longer governed anything beyond their own preservation. By the middle of the 20th century, many of America's Gilded Age mansions had entered a new phase of existence, one defined less by authority than by survival. Their private purpose exhausted, these structures faced a choice between adaptation and erasure. Demolition claimed some, but others endured through a process that fundamentally altered their meaning. Preservation did not restore power, it transformed it into memory. The early preservation movement emerged from a recognition that these buildings, whatever their origins, had become irreplaceable records of an era. Architectural societies, local historical organizations, and eventually state and federal agencies intervened to prevent wholesale loss. Their arguments were framed not in defense of elite privilege, but in terms of craftsmanship, urban history, and cultural education. The mansion was reclassified from instrument of dominance to artifact of study. This reclassification mattered. It shifted the moral burden from justification to explanation. Public ownership required reinterpretation. Rooms designed to impress now required context. Guides explained hierarchies that no longer governed daily life. Servant spaces once hidden became objects of curiosity. Kitchens, corridors, and quarters were restored to visibility, exposing the labor systems previously concealed. Preservation thus inverted the mansion's original logic. What had been minimized became central. What had been emphasized became subject to critique. This process was not neutral. Decisions about what to preserve, how to present it, and which narratives to foreground reflected contemporary values. Some interpretations emphasized architectural achievement and aesthetic ambition. Others foregrounded inequality, labor exploitation, and social conflict. The mansion became a site of negotiation between admiration and discomfort. Its walls could not be separated from the conditions of their creation, yet neither could they be reduced entirely to condemnation. Preservation required balance. The transformation also altered spatial authority. Where owners once controlled access and movement, visitors now move freely, guided by institutional logic rather than private command. Admission tickets replaced invitations. Scheduled tours replaced social seasons. The mansion's exclusivity dissolved into regulated openness. Authority migrated from family lineage to curatorial expertise. Power became interpretive rather than personal. This shift revealed a deeper continuity. While elite families lost control of these structures, institutions inherited a different kind of influence. Museums and preservation bodies shaped public understanding of the past, deciding which stories endured. The mansion no longer asserted dominance through presence alone, but through the narratives constructed around it. Power persisted, but in altered form, mediated by scholarship, funding, and cultural consensus. Not all houses adapted successfully. Preservation required resources, public interest, and political support. Many properties deteriorated beyond repair or were lost before intervention occurred. Their absence remains instructive. Demolished mansions testify to moments when society chose utility or indifference over memory. What survives does so not because of inevitability, but because of deliberate action. Preservation is an expression of values, not a guarantee of permanence. In their preserved state, these buildings now function as mirrors rather than monuments. They reflect the ambitions of their builders and the judgments of those who came later. Visitors encounter not authority, but evidence. The mansion no longer commands. It invites reflection. Its endurance depends not on wealth, but on relevance, on society's willingness to confront the uncomfortable origins of its grandeur without erasing them. The afterlife of the Gilded Age mansion thus completes a cycle. Architecture that once sought to naturalize inequality now exposes it. Structures designed to stabilize power now demonstrate its limits. What remains is not a celebration of elite triumph, but a record of how quickly certainty can solidify into stone and how slowly that stone can be reinterpreted once certainty fades. In the end, the Gilded Age mansion stands less as a testament to success than as a record of ambition exceeding its social foundations. These houses were constructed to solve a problem that architecture alone could never resolve: the desire to convert economic power into moral authority and speed into permanence. They were built to speak across generations, yet they emerged from conditions too volatile to sustain the message they carried. What remains is not the power they sought to secure, but the trace of a moment when confidence outpaced continuity. The builders of these estates believed, often sincerely, that scale and beauty could stabilize their place in history. They assumed that cultural legitimacy could be acquired through reference, that borrowed forms could substitute for inherited standing. For a time, this strategy appeared effective. The mansions commanded attention, shaped social rituals, and dominated landscapes. But authority derived from performance requires constant reinforcement. When economic conditions shifted, when public tolerance narrowed, when legal structures intervened, architecture could no longer compensate. What the houses could not secure was acceptance. They could not bind society to a shared understanding of legitimacy that favored private dominance. They could not outlast political reform, demographic change, or evolving moral standards. Their endurance as physical objects contrasts sharply with the brevity of the social order that produced them. This contrast is instructive. It reveals how quickly power can crystallize and how slowly its material expressions can adapt once its justification erodes. The collapse of elite control over these mansions was not violent or abrupt. It unfolded through attrition, rising costs, divided inheritances, public scrutiny, and changing expectations. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together, they dissolved the logic that had sustained private grandeur. The mansion did not fall. It emptied, transformed, or surrendered itself to new purposes. Its silence replaced its command. Today, these buildings persist as educational spaces, cultural artifacts, or absent silhouettes remembered through photographs and records. They no longer instruct through authority, but through exposure. Visitors move through rooms once designed to exclude them, encountering evidence of a social experiment that attempted to compress legitimacy into form. The experience is often ambivalent. Admiration coexists with discomfort. Craftsmanship invites respect even as inequality demands acknowledgement. This tension is the mansion's final lesson. The hidden cost of America's Gilded Age mansions lies not primarily in their maintenance or their excess, but in what they reveal about the limits of material power. They show that wealth can construct environments of extraordinary control, but cannot guarantee their endurance. They demonstrate that legitimacy cannot be built faster than society can absorb it, and that authority, once questioned, cannot be restored through stone alone. In this sense, the mansions succeeded only as records. They preserved the moment when elite ambition reached its architectural peak and encountered its social boundary. Their walls hold no answers, only evidence. What they leave behind is not power, but perspective, a reminder that dominance, however carefully designed, remains contingent, and that history ultimately reclaims even its most confident monuments.